I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. This is Trade Guy Scott. This week, Bill and I talk about export control changes and the world of export controls post the Wassenaar Agreement. We talk about a new report from the European Commission on European competitiveness and about the acquisition of U.S. Steel. All this and more on this week's Trade Guys.
Hello and welcome to the Trade Guys. Evan Brown here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch. It's been an exciting week or two in trade, as of course all weeks are here on the Trade Guys. So let's dive into the news. Our friends at the Commerce Department's BIS issued a new round of export controls on advanced tech, particularly including quantum computing inputs, advanced semiconductor manufacturing, including something called gate all-around field effect transistor technology, and additive manufacturing as well. They also introduced a presumption of denial licensing standard and a deemed export exception, which I'd love to hear you all explain further. This move was coordinated with partner countries outside of any formal multilateral structure or arrangement. So guys, can you explain why formal structures like the Wassenaar arrangement were bypassed here and provide an assessment of the ability of these new controls to keep these advanced technologies out of the hands of, say, Russia or China?
Well, first of all, Evan's youthful optimism betrays him. Not every week is an exciting week in trade. We can say that because that justifies our existence. But, in reality, there are slow weeks in trade, just like there are in other things. And this actually was not a particularly slow week because of the debate, which we're not going to talk about today. I would just throw in the interesting commentary that Trump talked about tariffs a lot because he always talks about tariffs. We'll weigh the wisdom of that separately another time. But what was intriguing about it is that Harris's approach to the problem was not to use the word tariff, but to refer to it as Trump's national sales tax, which I think is clever because first of all, people know what sales taxes are. They don't all know what tariffs are. And they pay sales taxes every day when they buy something. And calling it that makes it look bad, which is, I think, her point. And identifying Trump with it is, I think, good politics. Whether the whole idea is good economics is something we can discuss separately. Anyway, back to the topic. Evan summarized it. This is yet another fall export control adventure by BIS. The last two were in October. This one is coming in a month early. It's still relevant. It advances the ball forward by expanding controls in some high-tech areas. Evan mentioned them. Quantum computing, some additional semiconductor manufacturing equipment, additive manufacturing items to produce metal components. Additive manufacturing, for those of you that are not deeply into this, is wonk speak for 3D printing. And if you are interested in 3D printing, one of the things that actually Scott and I both worked on, he near the end of his time as the Scholl Chair and me at the beginning of my time at the Scholl Chair, was a project on 3D printing where we examine the technology and its trade implications. And you can, I'm sure, find that someplace in the Scholl Chair compendium of brilliant papers. They concluded that, plus GAFET, gate all-around field effect transistor technology, which Evan managed to get out correctly, got all the words right, better than I did. It's basically a chip architecture that primary thing it does is it helps reduce power consumption, which for advanced chips is not a small issue. So the thing that's interesting about this is not so much what they included, which was, I think, not unexpected, but they did it with a new license exception called License Exception IEC, Implemented Export Controls. And this means that countries that have adopted comparable controls are going to be exempt. And so far, that appears to mean Italy, the UK, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Japan, and Spain. This is interesting because it's a reflection on frustration with the Wassenaar arrangement, which is the multilateral organization that addresses dual-use export controls, aside from nuclear, missile, and chem bio, which are dealt with in separate regimes. And there's been growing frustration with Wassenaar because Russia is a member, and they have taken to objecting to most of the initiatives that have come up there in the last several years. And since it's a consensus-based organization, an objection kills it off. So there is no mechanism in Wassenaar for kicking a country out. We looked into that and discovered that. So the U.S. response instead has been, rather than kick them out, let's work around them. And let's think about developing new structures, not necessarily a new regime, not quite that formal, but let's see if we can get other Wassenaar members to join us in adopting new controls that the Russians would object to or have objected to. And that's what this is about. And it's interesting, both because it's a creative idea to deal with serious real-world problem. It's also interesting because so far they've gotten 8 countries to do it, which is not small cheese. But the other thing that's interesting about it is if you ask people at BIS, and I did actually on this, if everybody, all the 8 are doing the same thing, the answer is no. They're all doing this differently. So it is not like we have created a new regime where everybody has to basically do the same thing in order to meet the standards and follow the rules. Countries are encouraged to take similar parallel actions, but they're not doing it in a way that's the same. So one of the issues that will inevitably come up as this plays out is the United States having to try to get all of these countries to put their regulatory eggs in a single basket and do the same thing. And that piece has got a ways to go. That said, the fact that they got 8 countries to do anything in this area is not insignificant. So it's something that is important and that we'll continue to watch. And we'll also continue to watch whether they get more countries, which is the other important thing. Now, Evan also alluded to the deemed export rule, and I don't have a lot of details about that. For those of you that are not deeply into the weeds on this, deemed exports is a licensing concept that affects people, not things and not technology. And in its purest form, if an American company wants to hire a foreign engineer to do research or product development on something that is subject to export controls, that company needs to get a deemed export license for that individual, even though that individual is probably coming here to the United States to work. The theory is that by working on a project that involves control technology, that individual will be acquiring that technology. And when he goes back to where he came from, or where she came from, she'll be taking that technology with her, and that's an export. So while at the front end, it seems counterintuitive to have to get an export license to hire somebody. In fact, the reason is because that somebody might, at the end of the day, be him or herself an export with embedded technology. So in this case, they have expanded the existing deemed export rules to permit exceptions with respect to these technologies for a variety of people, but including people that come from some countries of concern. The theory is that by not doing that, and this is particularly a case with quantum, which is very much an incipient technology, if we don't do things that open the door to collaboration with smart scientists and engineers globally, we may be cutting ourselves off from some of the best people. And we may be cutting ourselves off from some of the best technology. And in an area like quantum, which is kind of wide open, rapidly moving, with a number of different threads to follow, and it's not clear yet which one is the best, relaxing your deemed export rules a bit, I think, is a smart move, because it will enable the United States to make a play for the best scientists and the best engineers. So good on them for figuring that out and trying to do something about it.
Overall, there's a recurring theme here. Bill's right about the substance. The recurring theme is that we have many economic and security structures that trace their origin to the end of World War II or the end of the Cold War. And those relationships, organizations, treaties, agreements are under strain now because the world's changed. And the Wassenaar Agreement's one of those. That was the right group of countries when it was started and becomes the wrong group of countries because time moves on. So this is something that when it comes to almost all security and economic arrangements, it's the nature of the world we live in. On deemed exports, I just wanted to add to Bill's point that this is an area where normal business of an international company can easily trip over a deemed export rule. Let me give you a specific example from my past, which is a company I worked for many years, acquired a privately held or closely held German company in the business of, among other things, hair care products. They were the shampoo company. And because they were a German company with business throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, they had operations in Iran. We acquired this firm, no problem at all. But one of the things that tends to be somewhat centralized in an international company are safety data sheets. So product safety is a pretty objective factor, and you collect the data and you have compilations of safety of ingredients that can be used in multiple circumstances. We wound up with a situation where there was a request from this German company for a product safety data sheet. It was to address a question raised by an Iranian regulator, because Iran has actually a pretty sophisticated regulatory apparatus, and its product safety rules are very similar to European safety rules. This seemed entirely a reasonable request. But as it turned out, the person responding to that from the global R&D organization, again, a chemist, a safety scientist, responded with a fact sheet. He was based in the United Kingdom. The individual who asked for it in the German company was a Russian citizen and had a Russian passport, and the ultimate data was going to Iran, which of course has had very restrictive sanctions from the U.S. since 1979, the fall of the Shah. So all of this turned into, certainly that data sheet wound up being a deemed export to that individual. So we're trying to make sure that people were satisfied with the safety of a product. We violated a U.S. export control rule. Totally accidental, nobody saw it coming, but that's how easy it is to run afoul of the rules. We're just trying to address a normal question from a normal regulator. Bad things happen. We fixed it, but it's just very easy to run afoul of rules like the deemed export rule.
I want to look at a new, long-awaited report from the former European Central Bank chief and former Italian Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, which was released last week. The European Commission requested this report about a year ago to look at the EU's economic competitiveness on a global level. Draghi wound up calling for a massive investment of around 800 billion euros in European industry, as well as some structural changes to the bureaucracy and the bloc aimed at increasing its ability to act decisively as a single market and promote innovation. So guys, what was the impetus for this report, and how likely does it seem that Europe will embrace these massive industrial policies that Draghi's proposing?
The background of this has been basically Europe losing ground in both industrial competitiveness and economic growth and value-added per capita income growth. So what you have is, it's a general problem, and it actually affects the United States as well. And if you look at it, if you have advanced economies, particularly with aging populations, or in some cases, like the case of Europe, declining populations, generate relatively slow growth. The only real way to speed up that growth consistently is to attract investment. And the key is investment has to be attracted, whether that's investment in physical plant and equipment or in ideas or whatever it might be. You're in a competition to attract investment. Now, it turns out we're in a world where there are massive investable assets out there. You look at the size of, for instance, the U.S. stock market or private equity markets of almost any sort. There is lots of investment capital that is available, but attracting it is the challenge, particularly in our current world. I would note that one of the things that is a legacy of the communications and technology revolution we're living through, the paradox of apps versus atoms. This was first stated by Peter Thiel in his experience as a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, and was asked, the question was, why don't people invent a new drug? Why don't people invest in new physical capabilities? That's the atoms part. Why do we invest in apps and not in atoms? And he said, well, it's very simple. If you're a venture capitalist looking for a presentation, you've got 4 young individuals who have a wonderful new video game that is likely to have a major market share, at least in its initial launch, asking for $1.5 million a startup. Or you have, behind door number 2, a new nuclear power plant, which we haven't opened one in the United States for about 50 years. And it would be great for carbon footprint and great for a steady supply of energy, but it has a regulatory process that lasts roughly 17 years, has an uncertain outcome, and which is the very reason we haven't done it in the United States in 50 years. So when you're weighing that as a venture capitalist, you always go with the app. You never work on the atoms. And this is the problem that Europe is facing in terms of being in a position to attract capital to invest and increase its per capita productivity. Paul Krugman, back when he was a trade economist, one of his books, he had a very famous quote, which is, per capita productivity isn't everything, but it's almost everything when it comes to economic success. And he's right. And growing per capita productivity is the key to higher incomes. Europe is suffering from this problem. Europe has, and 25 years ago, so the turn of the century, Europe's GDP per capita was about just over 15% underperforming versus the United States. Today, the gap is 30%. Now, that means Americans are on average 30% higher living standards than Europeans, but it also reflects the compounding of 25 years of low productivity growth. Now, all investment carries risk with it, whether it's shifting markets or unseen events. For instance, in 2019, many of you thought that building an office building in downtown Austin, Texas, would have been one of the safest investments imaginable, except nobody thought about COVID and the effect on commercial office space utilization post-pandemic, even in high-tech centers and fast-growing cities like Austin. So that's just an example of the risks that face any investment. It turns out that developing economies have government risk, which would include expropriation and political risk of many sorts. But as it turns out, the United States and Europe and other developed, advanced economies also have government risks, which comes in the form of slow-moving, difficult to manage, and unpredictable regulation. And sometimes it has its own political risks. I give you the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a problem for developed economies. It's a problem in Europe that Mario Draghi's report tries to address. I would note that in the United States, Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, in his letter to shareholders, pointed out that it's a choice whether you grow at 3% a year or 4% a year. And over, say, the 25 years of this century, had the U.S. chosen to take a low regulation, low barrier growth plan and it encouraged growth to a 4% level instead of 3%, we'd be a lot better off, and even governments would be better off as having the same effective tax rate, having a lot more dollars to invest and solve problems. So that's the essence of the problem in developed countries. I don't know what Europe is going to do about this. Between the net zero and other green energy initiatives and the conflict in Ukraine, which cut off the flow of cheap Russian gas to particularly Germany, it's not clear how quickly they can fix any of this. But that's the general problem, and it's a problem that we all have to work on at some point. And certainly the United States, in permitting reform and some of the initiatives that have been talked about but have not reached fruition, we have a lot of room to make ourselves better off if we chose to do so. That's the problem. It's a serious topic. I was amused that the New York Times observed that Europe was developing its 5-year strategic plan. And I thought 5-year plans were a Soviet feature, but apparently Europe is sufficiently Soviet to adopt the 5-year plan. But that irony, I think it's a serious problem for every developed country as we age, population ages, and the tendency to slow things down and bog things down, it doesn't have a counterweight.
I was intrigued by his comments, sort of a mini rant about EU regulation. And I guess my thought while Scott was talking about not knowing what the EU might do with it, since he pretty much trashes everything they've done for the last decade, I would not be surprised if it's not all that well received. It's also going to be expensive. I think, as Evan noted, he's recommending an additional 800 billion plus euros in expenditures. I thought two things about it were interesting. First of all, he talks at some length about the EU tendency to regulate, which is something that the Scholl chair has discussed in great detail in the digital space. An interesting factoid was in the last 5 years, the European Parliament has passed more than 13,000 pieces of legislation. The U.S. has approved 5,500 federal laws. So if your measurement is legal paper, we are way behind. But if you look at some of those 13,000 includes the Digital Services Act, the Digital Market Act, the AI Act, and some things like that. Well, I don't think the AI Act is finished yet. What he's really getting at is that the economy may be overregulated. And in fact, he recommends explicitly reducing the level of regulation and points out that more than 60% of EU companies see regulation as an obstacle to investment. And 55% of SMEs in particular have flagged regulatory obstacles and the administrative burden that comes along with them as their greatest challenge. It's not a small matter. He also points out another interesting factor, particularly at the high end. I mean, his basic point is that Europe has done a much better job of investing in old mature industries, I think is the more elegant word. And where they've really lost ground is investing in the industries of tomorrow. And he pointed out that of the top 50 tech companies in the world, only 4 of them are European, which I think tells you a lot about where the center of innovation is these days. And you can have an argument about whether it's in China or elsewhere in Asia or in the United States. But it seems pretty clearly it's not in Europe. If you want to focus on the future, I think what he's basically saying is that's something that needs to change. Now, the other interesting thing about it, and I'll stop with this, is that it reminded me a little bit of my experience on the China Commission, where we would periodically have hearings about all the various things the Chinese are doing in the industrial policy area that we don't like. Because we think, subsidization, IP theft, technology transfer, things like that. And the hearings would usually produce this long litany of bad things the Chinese are doing. Then there's the inevitable question from one of the commissioners. So what do we do about it? And pretty much every time the answer was, we should do what they're doing, even though they just got finished trashing what they were doing. There's a little bit of that in the Draghi report, because what he's really recommending is they ought to do what the Americans are doing in high tech. And for all their complaining about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and for all their complaining about the CHIPS Act and the industrial policy implications of both, what Draghi is really suggesting is the Europeans need to do the same thing. I thought that was interesting. And of course, it has a lot of trade implications, because at least in the United States, the CHIPS Act, the investment in innovative technology is coming along with protection and reshoring, onshoring, and Buy America provisions, which thus far Europe has avoided and which I don't see Draghi recommending. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Interesting stuff. Our final topic, which I'm very interested to hear your thoughts and or rants on, is the White House's telegraphed plan to block the $14.9 billion acquisition of U.S. steel by Japan's Nippon Steel using CFIUS because of alleged national security concerns. I should note that this isn't official yet, but there's certainly been some bipartisan pressure to kill this deal. So, guys, what's behind Biden's thinking on blocking this deal? And I'll try not to make this too much of a leading question, but do you see this as a national security issue, this foreign acquisition of steel manufacturing?
Well, the simple answer is politics. And the dilemma they got, if they want to turn it down, you have to have a national security reason for turning it down. And that's going to be very difficult to find in this case. And the dilemma they have is that the real reason and the ostensible national security reason are unrelated to each other. This is politics. And the irony of this is actually the politics is, I think, more mixed than people think. Once they start talking to workers that actually would be affected by this deal, you come away with a little bit more of a mixed bag than you would think. The union is clearly against it. Union leadership is clearly against it. And they said that from the beginning. I think the Biden administration has responded to that. I think initially, I was surprised when the president essentially came out against it last March, which kind of preempted the whole process. I think he did it because the union wanted them to do it. I think the union wanted them to do it because they thought it would give them more leverage negotiating with Nippon Steel. I don't know if it did or not, but it didn't give them enough because there's no agreement. And that's, to me, is kind of a missed opportunity. I thought from the beginning, the only way this is going to happen is if the United Steelworkers and Nippon Steel reach a deal. And then the union stands up and says, this is good. It's good for American workers. We're for it. You should approve the deal. That's the only way Biden and all the other politicians of both parties, that have dug themselves into a hole on this will have enough political cover to go ahead with it. Right now, that appears to not be happening. The union has been very clear in its objections and very inflexible in its objections. And the company pretty clearly has not met their demands. And there we sit. And in that situation, I think it'll go down. But to answer Evan's question, it'll go down for a phony reason. The ostensible reason I think that they're looking at is that there might be a future trade complaint, anti-dumping or subsidy complaint, that the U.S. steel industry as a whole files against somebody, possibly Nippon. And the way the U.S. rules work when that happens is the Commerce Department will accept the petition if a majority of the domestic industry that expresses a view on the complaint is for the complaint. And there's concern in this case that if a foreign company owns U.S. Steel and decides not to support some future trade complaint, that might put the industry below the 50% threshold. It would depend on a lot of things at the time, who produces the products in question in particular. So it might or it might not, but I think that's a concern. And then that's extrapolated to say, well, if we can't file trade complaints in the future, which has been their bread and butter, not to mention that of a half dozen law firms in town, if we can't do that, then our national security will be adversely affected. I mean, the short answer to that is this is the kind of thing that is rather easily dealt with in what's called a mitigation agreement with CFIUS. Nippon just promises not to do that. And that's not the hardest promise for them to make. Won't cost them very much. But that's not a strong argument, I have to say. The other argument was that Nippon has a relationship with a Chinese steel company. Apparently, Nippon recently broke off that relationship in an effort to move this deal through. So they're kind of grasping at national security straws on this. But I guarantee you, if it goes down, they'll find one. The history of this is that one of these cases went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supremes decided that the president's decision was not subject to judicial review. The process by which he made the decision was subject to judicial review. So you can sue the president on this one if he didn't follow the rules. But at the end of the day, if he rejects it, I think that's going to stick. Scott, over to you.
Well, look, I always scratch my head at these things because I wonder if there are any economists working in places like the Treasury Department. Big picture, the United States is the largest recipient of foreign direct investment on the planet, both in terms of annual flows and in stocks. Given our fiscal position and the way we run deficits at peacetime at full employment, we need the money. And it's a good thing we have open investment policy to attract foreign investment. It's good for the economy. It's good for jobs. It's good for employment. Nobody bothers to say that. Maybe nobody in the administration thinks that. It is true, whether they think it or not. Second, the specifics of this deal, you've got to look at why people did what they did. Why is Nippon Steel interested in acquiring U.S. assets? It is because, by policy, this administration and Congress has implemented more and more Buy America restrictions on steel. The market is short, okay? And they're a competitive company, and they want to have a successful business in the United States, and they can't do it with imports because of the Biden administration and the Congress's policy. Now, in doing so, they had the approval of the U.S. Steel Board of Directors. Why did the U.S. Steel Board of Directors approve this initiative? Well, because it helps to modernize U.S. Steel and make it a more successful company in the future. This is why when this first came up on the program and Senator Vance and Senator Brown of Ohio were in turmoil over the matter, I encouraged them to go to Toledo, Ohio, and tour the Jeep factory, which is new and modern and a dramatic change from the 100-year-old Overland factory where Jeeps used to be made in Toledo, thanks to Stellantis, a Dutch company. And so foreign investment is good for workers in the United States. It's good for U.S. businesses. U.S. Steel directors believed it was in the interest of U.S. Steel to go forward with this acquisition. Third, if this is blocked for the reasons Bill says, and I think he's probably right, I want to hear no more smug lectures about rule of law, okay? Because we let politics overtake our rules, And that's not just a bad look for America. That would deter foreign investment in the future. We'd get what we deserve, and fiscal life in the United States would become more difficult. So I wish somebody was looking out for the country's interest, at least somebody who had the basic idea of the economic principles involved here. But I guess that's too much to ask for these days.
One of the unanswered questions is, if this goes down, what the effect will be on other inbound foreign investment. The Japanese government has been quiet about this, but, they're a friend and an ally. This is not Chinese investment coming in. And if I were a Japanese company watching all this, I would think twice about a future investment into the United States. Now, maybe going back to Scott's earlier example, maybe if I were in the shampoo business, I wouldn't be too worried about it, because it's even harder to find a national security link, with all due respect, for shampoo. And if I were in other countries, I'd think about this too. If we're going to do this to a friend and ally like Japan, we can do this to anybody. And if politics is going to rule rather than economics, I think it's going to be a deterrent. There are lots of economists at the Treasury Department. But the other thing at the Treasury Department is a bunch of civil servants who, among other things, are really good at reading the room. And when the president makes a public statement twice on this subject, they probably get the hint.
On that very positive note, we will end it. We'll bring our youthful exuberance into next week.
Speaking of which, next week, as threatened last week, we're going to have Scott Kennedy on. Scott is CSIS's trustee chair in Chinese economics, and he's going to tell us what's going on in China, why it matters, and hopefully we'll have a discussion about what we should do about it.
Tune in for that next week, and thank you very much. Have a good one.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.